In this lecture, we will look at how archaeologists document patterns and how material culture, the objects that people make and use, artifacts, architecture, changes through time and across space, and how we interpret these changes in order to understand how human behaviors and technologies evolve. Archaeologists organize this data into meaningful patterns in order to understand how past human behaviors changed and how past human societies were transformed. Archaeologists divide time into periods and phases. A period is a block of time that is characterized by a particular economic or technological adaptation, while phases are smaller subdivisions of time that are often characterized by distinctive artifact assemblages and architectural forms, particular types of pottery, particular types of houses, and phases are often specific to even smaller regions than the larger general periods. These larger general periods in the archaeological record of the Americas include the Paleo-Indian period, with an adaptation of big game hunters to the Ice Age environments. This is followed by the Archaic period, as modern environments emerge with climate change and transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, and human societies develop adaptations to these environments, becoming what we call broad-spectrum foragers, people who used a wide range, a broad spectrum of the resources that were available in their local environments. In some places, this archaic adaptation continued until contact with Europeans. However, in most areas, the adoption of agriculture after the development of the domestication of plants and animals led to a formative adaptation, as people moved into small villages and developed new social systems to integrate kin groups that formerly lived dispersed across the landscape. In some areas, this formative adaptation transformed with the development of complex societies and cities, true urban centers. This is called the Classic period, although we'll see that this term is also used in other contexts. You may be familiar with this general concept of dividing time into periods based upon technological or economic characteristics of these periods by your studies of American history. So here, these charts show different prehistoric and historic periods in the state of Ohio, beginning with the Paleo-Indian, Archaic, and then formative period woodland and Mississippian cultures. It then is followed by different historic eras, the French era, the British era, the American frontier, the Northwest Territory, the state of Ohio, as different political and economic processes transformed human societies that occupied this same region. When lacking written records, archaeology is the type of evidence that is used in order to understand these transitions in the past. This table presents phase sequences used by archaeologists here in the American Southwest to understand cultural change in different regions: the ancestral Pueblo region of the Four Corners, the northern Sonoran region around Flagstaff, and the Hohokam region around Phoenix and Tucson. Now, occasionally we will have tables and charts with dates and phase names like this, but I don't expect you to remember all of these names and dates. I want you to focus on the big picture of transitions. When you need details like dates, it's usually easier to look those up rather than trying to memorize them. And that is what I do in my research. For example, I may know the time period during which a certain ceramic type is made if it is important, but others I will look up. So I know that Flagstaff black on white was produced between 1125 and 1225, but other types that are not as important in my research I would have to look up. I don't expect you to memorize all of these dates, and I want you to keep your eyes on the forest, not the individual trees, to understand the changes, the big picture transitions that are occurring rather than focusing on specific details like dates. While periods and phases divide time, culture areas are spatial divisions that are defined upon cultural similarities in economic and technological adaptations that are reflected in a geographic pattern of material culture distribution, that certain artifacts and house forms and other aspects of the human-built environment are patterned to specific regions. The similarities and differences between these patterns of material culture across different regions reveal interaction between different regions, both political and economic interactions, as well as define social boundaries. Now, these culture areas are often constrained by certain geographic and environmental characteristics, by mountain ranges, by the distribution of certain ecosystems, by bodies of water. This map shows some of the broad culture areas that are found in North America, areas within which there were general cultural similarities because of shared adaptations to similar environments. So in the Southwest, you had village farmers who grew corn, beans, and squash and had specific technologies that allowed them to adapt to these arid environments. On the plains, you had mobile hunter-gatherers who pursued herds of bison and moved often in order to follow the availability of resources. And in each different region, key resources and environmental characteristics helped define the cultural and technological adaptations of the populations that lived there. These broad culture areas can be further subdivided into other smaller archaeological cultures or traditions on the basis of more discriminatory analysis of the material culture. So all of the people that lived in the American Southwest grew corn, beans, and squash, made pottery, and lived in villages. But differences in the way that they made their pottery, differences in the houses that they made in these villages, differences in the way that they arranged their settlements across the landscape allow us to define these different cultural traditions, like the Hohokam here in the southern deserts, shown in pink, who lived in large dispersed villages and pit houses that were fairly shallow during the early period, and then above ground adobe compounds during later periods. They were dependent upon irrigation agriculture, and they manufactured red-on-buff pottery and cremated their dead. In contrast, the Puebloan people, shown in the orange to the north, lived in deep pit houses early, later shifting to above-ground masonry structures. They were dry farmers. They did not use irrigation canals, but rather dependent upon the limited rainfall, and had developed sophisticated agricultural techniques to adapt to the arid environment. They made black-on-white pottery, and rather than cremating their dead, they buried their dead. And we can see even differences among different Puebloan groups based upon architectural characteristics and differences in pottery style. Similarly, the Mesoamerican area, the parts of Central America and Mexico that were occupied by complex societies in later prehistory, also have different culture areas. And we will be looking at the Olmec area, shown here in pink along the Gulf Coast, the Teotihuacan culture in central Mexico, shown in brown, and Mayan cultures, shown in green. Archaeologists study these changing patterns of material culture in order to understand the evolution of human societies. Humans entered the Americas as small bands of hunter-gatherers about 15,000 years ago, and these are small groups of 30 to 50 people, people who were closely related, who lived dispersed across the landscape and moved quite a bit in order to follow the resources that they were gathering from the environment. Since then, human societies have diversified into a variety of social forms. When encountered by Europeans, Native American groups ranged from small seasonally mobile bands that were perhaps much like those earliest colonists of the Americas, to large empires that had urban centers and millions of people. How did this diversity arise? And were there common factors in the development of social complexity in different areas? Or are there differences in the evolution of human societies in different areas? What do you think are some factors that influence the evolution of human societies? Think about the reading from Earl and what he suggested influenced the development of more complex societies. There are several factors that influence the evolution of human societies. The nature of the resources available in the local environment, their distribution, their availability, how productive they are, how reliable they are in this productivity. Also characteristics of the population. How mobile is it? Or, in contrast, how sedentary are they? How much do they stay in one place versus move around a lot? How dense is the population? Is there a high density or a low density? What is the rate of growth or decline of the population? What is the nature of their technological adaptation? And technology is defined as the ability to use tools in order to improve other conditions. What is their level of technology and how can they adapt to their, or even transform their environment using their technologies? What is the nature of the cooperative social institutions that exist? How does kinship found the basis of community? How is religion used to integrate different kin groups? How does government build upon these in order to bring together a community? And how does economic trade bring different regions together? As much as there is cooperation, there is also competition and conflict. And how does competition for resources and conflict over them influence the evolution of human societies? The concept of evolution was developed and systematized by Charles Darwin in his book On the Origin of Species. He saw evolution as the progressive change through time from simple to complex forms, and this change was shaped by adaptation to the environment. And this concept of evolution is very influential on anthropology and understanding the transformation of human societies from small-scale, simple forms into larger-scale forms, and how these changes are shaped by adaptation to the local environment. Not just the physical environment, but the local social environment. Lewis Henry Morgan is one of the founders of the discipline of anthropology and developed the idea of cultural evolution in his book Ancient Society. He believed that human cultures have progressed through successive stages of development and that these changes from different stages were based on differences in technology, economy, and social organization. Now, the terms that Morgan used to define these stages may seem a little pejorative to us, as he called them savagery, barbarism, and civilization. Savagery is characterized by the use of stone tools by hunters and gatherers. Barbarism develops after the introduction of agriculture, pottery, and the development of metal tools. Civilization is characterized by cities and writings. Morgan influenced Karl Marx, who is very interested in understanding how did political and economic inequality emerge. How did states and social classes develop? And how was political and religious ideology used to justify and enforce social stratification and inequality? And these are key questions in archaeology and understanding the transformation of human societies from small-scale egalitarian bands to large-scale empires with institutionalized systems of social and economic inequality. While Morgan's unilineal evolution saw a lineal progress from savagery through barbarism to civilization and suggested that perhaps those who were still savages or barbarians lacked some capacity of those cultures that had developed into civilizations, Julian Stewart suggested that each culture's evolutionary trajectory was unique and influenced by its local environment and history, that there were no stages that every culture must progress through, and there was no apogee that every culture should strive to achieve, that each was unique and finely tuned and developed to adapt to its own local environment. So rather than progression through stages, each culture is on its own trajectory, influenced by various factors that are unique to its own local environment. Anthropologists Elman Service and Morton Fried were interested in understanding the variation in different forms of political and economic organization, and they created a typology in order to classify these patterns. Service and Fried broadly differentiated between egalitarian societies with no institutionalized social inequality and ranked societies that had systematic institutionalized social inequalities. In egalitarian societies, the number of high-status social roles is equal to the number of people that have the ability to fill them. No individual wields complete authority over another, and all members of these societies generally have equal access to life-sustaining resources. The key to leadership is experience and social standing. Social position and status are not inherited, and the primary dimensions of status, what differentiates people, is gender and age, and the experience that comes with age. Group social relations in egalitarian societies are largely determined by kinship. Status refers to the rights, duties, privileges, powers, liabilities, and immunities that accrue to recognized and named social positions. And these recognized and named social positions range from the small-scale things like father and mother to the more large-scale roles of kings or emperors. Ascribed status refers to rights, duties, and obligations that accrue to a person by inheritance. Like the king is the king because of their birth from the previous king. Achieved status, in contrast, refers to rights, duties, and obligations that accrue by the virtue of what a person accomplishes through their lifetime, earning the respect and recognition of their community of peers. Small-scale egalitarian societies are called bands. Bands are composed of 30 to 50 related people and are politically independent units. They are usually associated with mobile foragers that have low population densities. Within bands, leadership roles are filled by people of ability and ambition, although decision-making is done by group consensus. While politically independent, bands are economically and biologically interdependent with neighboring bands. They are economically interdependent because resources are not evenly distributed across the landscape. There are some resources that may be found only within one band's territory and not within another's, and they must exchange in order to gain access to these. So high-quality obsidian used to make tools may be found only in one band's territory, and they may exchange it for a certain type of plant or other material that is only available in the other band's territory. They are biologically interdependent because within a band, everyone is related. And if you needed to gain a mate, a husband, or a wife, you needed to bring them from another community, another neighboring band. So bands were allied through intermarriage with one another, which assisted in making economic transactions as well. This photo shows a camp of a band of Paiute Indians near Kanab, Utah in the 1860s. The Paiutes moved across a wide area, gathering different edible plants and hunting different animals, and they would stay in certain areas for just brief periods of time, leaving a very light footprint upon the landscape. Now, some sites that are used by bands would be repeatedly visited year after year, leading to larger deposits of materials that could be identified archaeologically. But those that were only used for a short period of time, or maybe even just once, have a limited number of artifacts and are often difficult to identify archaeologically. Tribes have a higher level of political integration than bands, but are often still egalitarian. They are composed of different unilineal descent groups, different kin groups have been brought together in new communities. Membership in ritual or military associations, what anthropologists call sodalities, would cross-cut these kin groups and integrate the community as a whole. Now, these different sodalities provided numerous high-status social roles for people of ability and ambition to fill, and leadership roles were usually not inherited, and decision-making was still largely made by consensus. There was little coercive authority. Tribes are usually associated with sedentary foragers, horticulturalists and pastoralists, people who have highly productive economies that allow people to settle down into larger communities, bringing multiple bands together in order to cooperate socially and economically. We begin to see the beginnings of ranking and the emergence of social inequality in some tribes, with relative ranking of different kin groups and control of certain leadership roles or certain resources by specific kin groups. This artist's reconstruction of a Cherokee village gives an overview of what a tribal community would look like. We see a variety of houses of different functions that are scattered throughout the community, each representing a different household. These households are likely related and interrelated through marriage, and they're integrated through ritual activities and political activities. And we see in the right center a house with a conical roof that is more than twice as large as the others. This is a community structure where the community would come together for ritual and political activities. These more sedentary communities that are occupied for generation after generation leave more substantial archaeological remains to be investigated. As bands came together to form tribes, the different groups of related people that formed these bands continued to often be recognized as distinct within these new larger communities through the principle of kinship that bonded these groups together. Different types of unilineal descent groups emerged, and unilineal descent groups are those that recognize a common descent from a single ancestor. A lineage is the basic form of a unilineal descent group, and this is one that can demonstrate descent from a common apical ancestor, a single founder. And this can be demonstrated genealogically through a series of relationships over time. Clans are when you have multiple lineages that are considered related to one another, but they cannot demonstrate this common descent to what is essentially a mythical founding ancestor. Clans are named and often associated with a totemic plant or animal, with a place name, or the description of the qualities of the members. So among the Hopi, there are the Honangyam, the Bear Clan, an animal totem related to the story of the emergence of this clan from the underworld and their initial encounter with a bear. Among the Navajo, there are the Tachi, the Red Running into the Water clan, a totemic place name, the place where the clan members first began to practice agriculture. Among the Crow, there are the Uatasha, the Greasy Mouth clan, which reflects the personal qualities of its members and is related to a story of their great hunting ability, and that they had lots of high-quality bison meat, and the members of the clans, their mouths were always filled with grease from all of this good meat they were eating, and they could spit into the fire and it would burst into flame. Clans with common shared histories that are considered related are sometimes grouped into phratries. Phratries and clans primarily act to regulate marriage. There are certain clans that you cannot marry, fellow phratry members, but there are other clans with whom you are expected to intermarry, and these intermarriages create relationships and alliances between clans that knit the community together. Another form of unilineal descent group is the moiety, and that's when a society is divided into two unilineal descent groups. Here in the American Southwest, in the Upper Rio Grande, many societies have moieties that are metaphorically named for the seasons, for winter and summer, sometimes literally winter and summer, other times turquoise and butterfly, or turquoise and squash, where turquoise metaphorically is related to coldness of winter, and butterflies and squash with the growth of summer. These moieties often form a basis of social reciprocity, or arrangements of shared political and ritual authority. So in these Native American groups of the Upper Rio Grande, New Mexico, during the winter season, the chief of the winter moiety is the leader of the community. And then, as they shift to the summer season, the leader of the summer moiety becomes the leader of the community. There's also reciprocity, and if a member of one moiety dies, members of the other community, the other moiety, are responsible for performing their burial rites, providing food, digging the grave, overseeing the ritual acts, in order to relieve the relatives this responsibility. Unlike egalitarian societies, ranked societies limit the high-status social roles so that not everyone can achieve one. There are relatively permanent social stations that are maintained with people having unequal access to the life-sustaining resources in the environment. Social position and status are inherited in ranked societies. There is more economic and political specialization, whereas in egalitarian societies, everyone's a hunter, gatherer, or farmer. As we get into ranked societies, we begin to see economic specialization, with people performing specific tasks in exchanging the goods and services that they produce with others. And this leads to more political specialization in order to manage these more complex economies. These are economies that redistribute goods and services throughout the community, and those at the top, the managers, keep some for themselves. Group social relations are determined primarily by political and economic roles rather than by kinship. In chiefdoms, leadership roles are inherited, and the chief and his immediate kin are a social and political elite. Political authority resides in a single individual, and this individual has coercive authority. The chiefly role is inherited and often has supernatural sanction. Chiefdoms are often composed of local communities that differ from one another in terms of rank and status, with the chief living at the largest and most powerful community, and other dependent communities, sometimes led by members of his kin group, surround this central community and produce goods and services that are fed into the chiefly center. Often associated with highly productive agricultural or foraging societies, anywhere where there is a potential for the creation of surpluses. Surpluses in the production of resources gathered from the environment, or surpluses from the production of agricultural goods. We begin to see the separation between producers, the workers, and their ruling managers. But in chiefdoms there are only two levels of class, the chiefly elite and then the commoners below them. In this artist's reconstruction of a Mississippian chiefly center, the site of Moundville in central Alabama, we can see some of the distinctions between the lives of the chiefs, those who are living in the houses on top of mounds and platforms, versus the lives of the commoners. There is ranking within the society, and the proximal distance to the mounds and the size of the mounds relate to the relative ranking of the individuals. The paramount chief of this community, the leader of the entire community, lived on top of the largest and tallest mound in the lower central part of the site. Other smaller mounds in the peripheral areas, but still within the stockade that encloses the community, are the residences of various other members of the chiefly elite, sometimes leaders of other kin groups within the community. And then you have other houses, both within and outside of the stockade, that are occupied by commoners. And further out from this chiefly center, there are other smaller communities that pay allegiance in the form of political and economic allegiance to the chiefly center. These create large and complex archaeological sites, and differentiation within the site allows us to understand differentiation within the community. States are complex societies characterized by economies that have a complex division of labor and task specialization. These complex economies require the development of new systems of writing and record keeping. States have centralized authority that is maintained by political and religious ideology and supported by bureaucracy. Leadership roles are inherited in states, and these bureaucratic institutions rule through the authority of the institution, not the individuals that fulfill these roles. Think of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It has many different members, agents, and various managers, and a director. But people cycle through these roles. It doesn't matter who the director is. It doesn't matter who the agent is. Its authority comes from the institution itself. And these are important aspects of state-level management and control. The right to use force is monopolized as a state power, and they develop a professional military and police class. So within our society, the right to use force is monopolized by the police and the military, and we differentiate between a military that directs its force outwards, providing defense and offense against external enemies, and a police class that is used to maintain internal order. In early states, these two were considered often together. But the right to use force was monopolized as a state power. Individual members of the community could not use force without suffering sanctions of the state. Just like in our community, police are the only ones who are allowed to use force under certain circumstances and contexts. Under most circumstances and contexts, if you use force against a fellow citizen, you will be in trouble. If your neighbor is disturbing you while you're studying for this class by playing lots of loud music and having friends over to play beer pong, you can't go over and use force against them, smashing up their stereo, breaking their beer bottles, without being subject to sanctions by the state for disorderly conduct. And in early states, the right to use force was often exerted with deadly consequences upon those who objected to any aspects of state control. Economic production and distribution were controlled by the state. You have an elite class of rulers and their attached functionaries. You have a middle class of craft workers who are producing products, many of them for elite consumption, others for consumption by the wider community, a variety of bureaucrats and other managers, and the military. There's a lower class of peasant farmers who are often working land to produce for elite landlords. They do not own the land themselves, and they're producing not just to feed themselves, but to feed into a state system of food redistribution. In this artist's reconstruction of a Mayan city-state, the site of Copan in Honduras, we see the center, which has the monumental construction that is used to validate the power and authority of the ruling elite. These pyramids support temples to the gods and the ancestors and often contain tombs of the earlier rulers of the kingdom within them. We see a large square that can be used as a market there on the far left of the image, where resources that are produced in surrounding communities are brought and exchanged among specialist producers. There are communities where people are farmers, sometimes farmers producing and specializing in the production of certain crops. Other communities, people are producing certain craft goods like pottery or baskets or weaving textiles, and all of these resources and the goods and services produced are exchanged in markets associated with the political and ritual centers of the community. Also, in the left side, you can see people gathered around a ball game, a ritual activity that brings the entire community together and allows competition between communities and between segments of the communities in a rule-bound context that limits the escalation of violence, because the exercise of violence is monopolized as a state power. And it was a very important power for these early states as they competed against each other to control territory and the resources within them. Not just resources like arable land and resources that could be extracted like jade or obsidian, but also the resource of the people living upon the land and producing agricultural products and craft goods. So warfare becomes very important in the competition between state-level societies. And finally, we have empires, which are large states of heterogeneous ethnic and cultural composition. They bring together many different ethnic groups, and they are formed by conquest and coercion as one state expands and conquers adjacent states in order to take control of their territory and extract the wealth and resources from these subjugated territories. Examples of Native American empires include the Aztec and their contemporaries, the Tarascans in Mesoamerica. And in South America, there are the Inca, who are contemporaries of the Aztec, but were not in contact with them, and earlier empires of the Chimu, Tiwanaku, and Wari. This map shows how the Aztec Empire expanded through the rule of successive emperors, conquering and controlling new territories, incorporating them into the Aztec imperial system. And we will compare the strategies of imperial expansion between the Aztec and the Inca empires. So what are some of the pathways to power? How did some segments of the community come to elevate themselves over others? In many cases, literally elevate themselves over others, such as in the case of the Mississippian chiefs who lived on top of the platforms and looked down at their subjects. So what do you think are some pathways that allowed the consolidation of power? The three primary pathways to power are control over the economy, control of the military, and control of ideology. Control of the economy allows control of the production and distribution of resources, both the importation of hard-to-obtain exotic materials, as well as the distribution of important life-sustaining subsistence goods. Control of the military provides might and intimidation in order to create and maintain power. And control of ideology, the use of politics and religion in order to justify this natural order of inequality. So some things to remember are how archaeologists use periods, phases, and culture areas in order to organize material remains in time and space, how unilineal and multilineal evolution differ, what the differences are between egalitarian and ranked societies, how these different types of societies from bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, and empires differ in their scale, and how does the nature of political and economic organization vary among bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, and empires, and what are some pathways to power leading to the emergence of ranked societies.